Imagine having life's most precious gift stolen from you and never knowing who, how, where, or why. Parents of abducted children live this nightmare every day as they suffer ambiguous loss, not knowing the whereabouts or fate of their missing child. We are all familiar with the case of William Terrell, that little 3-year-old boy who vanished without a trace from his grandmother's home in Kendal, New South Wales, 4 years ago. But there are so many more cases of missing children which aren't in the public spotlight and are in danger of being forgotten. One of those is 5-year-old Rene Akin, who was kidnapped from her home in Narooma, New South Wales, 34 years ago. Rene shared a bedroom with her older brother, who awoke early on the morning of the 17th of February back in 1984 to discover Rene's bed was empty and the back door wide open. I was a similar age to Rene when she was snatched from her bed, and I lived in a town only an hour away. But on this particular night, as I lay safe in my bed, someone stole this little girl from her family, and she has never been seen since. She didn't get the chance to grow up like I did. But sadly, William and Rene are just 2 of the 2,600 long-term missing people in Australia. An equally confronting statistic is that it is estimated that there could be up to 500 sets of unidentified human remains in Australia, many of which have been archived as cold cases for decades. Are some of our missing children amongst these bones which have never been identified? Many relatives have said that if they had to make the choice between seeking justice or bringing a loved one home, they would choose to locate their loved one's remains and lay them to rest. With the help of DNA testing, the parents of Matthew Levison and Daniel Morecambe were able to do just that. As the forensic DNA specialist tasked with pioneering a new DNA identification laboratory in New South Wales a few years ago, I became aware of the magnitude of unidentified and missing persons cases across the country. And armed with that knowledge, I have become a self-declared forensic humanitarian, committed to finding and advocating for a solution to this silent mass disaster. I am convinced that modern DNA technology is the answer to restoring the names and faces of many of these Australians. So a couple of years ago, I embarked on a Churchill fellowship, travelling across 3 continents solo for 6 weeks to investigate how other countries are using DNA technology to identify their missing. The fellowship was a life-changing experience, both professionally and personally. One of the most transformative parts of the trip was spending time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, learning how the International Commission on Missing Persons developed the world's largest DNA identification program for missing persons in the wake of the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, which left up to 40,000 people, mostly men and boys, unaccounted for. So what I experienced as I travelled across this country were the residual sights, sounds and smells of one of the most heinous human rights violations in history. The genocide in Bosnia saw thousands of children victimised and left thousands of mothers searching for their missing sons. And the emotions this stirred were amplified by the fact that I had to leave my 2.5-year-old son and 10-month-old breastfed daughter behind. So I'm now passionate about ensuring that the personal sacrifices I had to make to complete that journey, like missing my daughter walk for the first time, or expressing breast milk in toilets all over the globe if I had any chance of feeding my baby on my return, do contribute to changing the state of play for the underserved and under-resourced missing persons sector. I need my children to understand that my time away from them then, and many weekends since, is driven by my desire to help the long list of families whose children have been missing for decades. And for me, it's also about knowing that if one of my children were missing, the processes I am championing to put in place would ensure the timely identification of their remains and resolution of my family's ambiguous loss. So my mission was to devise a list of recommendations for implementing an Australian DNA identification program for missing persons. So simply, if we are able to recover DNA from the hundreds of untested bones, DNA matching could reveal their identity and determine if they are some of the thousands of long-term missing people. What I observed overseas is that DNA technology is being used successfully to identify large numbers of victims of war, genocide, migration, terrorism, and natural disasters. Yet very few countries have implemented a DNA testing program specifically for routine missing persons cases. I am recommending we establish a dedicated facility for missing persons casework. This facility would have the human, physical, and financial resources to forensically examine and identify all of our archived human remains cases. Also, a new national DNA database capability has just been rolled out, which will facilitate the national searching of DNA profiles from unknown deceased individuals, missing persons, or their relatives. So this means that parents with a missing child who live in New South Wales can now have their DNA routinely searching against the DNA from bones recovered anywhere in Australia. But a database is only as good as the data that's in it. That is why it's vital we now populate this database with DNA profiles from all of our stored bones and all of our long-term missing people or their relatives in order for identifications to be made. Tasmania's oldest missing persons case was solved earlier this year after DNA testing revealed that bones located at the base of Mount Wellington back in 1972 were those of Joyce Baxter. Joyce was a 43-year-old mother who had been missing since 1955. And identification was only possible after all this time because DNA, which had recently been recovered from her skull, was able to be compared to Joyce's living daughter. We've also begun to exploit areas of DNA that can predict the ancestry and physical appearance of an individual. Imagine if we could apply this new technology to humanise a box of bones. So inform an investigator that these remains are those of a female missing person of European ancestry with blonde hair, blue eyes and fair skin. This could provide new investigative leads when all traditional avenues of inquiry have been exhausted. Or it could add colour to the facial reconstruction of a skull. DNA testing is cheaper, faster, and better than it's ever been, making a DNA-led identification approach a bloody good option. But of course there's a cost associated with it. The exemplary missing persons programs across the world are government funded. The University of North Texas Center for Human Identification has received almost $14 million in National Institute of Justice funding since 2004. So that's about $1 million a year to provide free DNA testing services for any missing persons case in the US. Has that been money well spent? Over 2,000 missing people have been identified with the assistance of DNA testing in that facility alone to date. So, should the Australian government fund a similar National Centre for Human Identification to analyse the remains of all of our nameless Australians and determine if any of our long-term missing people are represented amongst the deceased, and in the process solve some of Australia's most baffling cold cases? Crowdfunding initiatives are also becoming considered a viable alternative to shift casework backlogs. For example, in California, they slapped a $2 compulsory fee on death certificates to fund their missing persons DNA program. And generous Texans can now make a voluntary donation towards the testing of sexual assault kits when they renew their driver's license. There's even a charity in the US called the DNA Doe Project, which is collecting public donations so that law enforcement agencies with tight budgets can use genetic genealogy services to try and identify their John and Jane Does. Lauren O'Keefe, the fearless founder of the Missing Persons Advocacy Network charity here in Australia, believes that corporate partnerships are an untapped resource for sharing the faces and stories of the missing and lessening the financial impact on those families searching for them, whilst connecting the corporate partner with a large chunk of the consumer market, especially when we consider that close to 500,000 Aussies are affected by the disappearance of a relative, friend or colleague every year, even for a short time period. So, should we be considering public, corporate or philanthropic sponsorship for this identification effort? Regardless of how this gets funded, the longer we deliberate about a path forward for these remains, the more degraded they will become. So we need to be taking action now. At the Australian Facility for Taphonomic Experimental Research, colloquially known as the Sydney Body Farm, selfless Australians are donating their bodies to science so that we, the forensic scientists, can improve DNA testing from degraded bones. Surely, the least we can do as living human beings is commit as many resources as required to identify our missing Australians and ensure they are not forgotten. So here is my call to action. Establish a national centre for human identification exclusively for missing and unidentified persons cases, old and new. Commence a national DNA testing program for the 500 untested, unidentified human remains. Collect a DNA reference sample from all 2,600 long-term missing people or their relatives, regardless of how long ago their family member vanished, how distantly related they are, or even if they need to be exhumed. And we need to populate the national DNA database with every single one of these DNA profiles to facilitate the effective and efficient DNA identification of our unknown and missing Australians. The use of DNA testing for law enforcement purposes will continue to spark debate around the protection of our civil liberties, our privacy, and our human rights. But are we violating human rights by not affording every deceased Australian a proper forensic examination to establish their identity and cause of death so they can have a dignified burial, families can get the answers they so long for, and justice can be served? So finally, to all those involved in investigating missing persons cases, let's ensure we are utilising forensic DNA testing to its full potential to help identify all of those children lost and found, and in the process, solve some of Australia's most baffling cold cases. And hopefully one day we will reunite William and Rene with their families. I know if one of my children were missing, I would want no stone unturned, no resource spared, no DNA untested if it meant bringing them home, dead or alive. Thank you.